In the heart of a vast savanna, where golden grass swayed like an endless ocean beneath the sun, lay the ancient village of Kumbasa. For generations beyond count, Kumbasa had been known not for its size or strength, but for something far more powerful, its unbroken bond with the ancestors. The people believed that every stone, every tree, every drop of water carried the memory of those who had walked the land before them. Life was not simply lived, it was guided, protected, and shaped by the spirits of their forefathers who watched from the unseen world. At the center of the village stood the most sacred place in all of Kumbasa, the shrine of the ancestral flame. It was a small circular structure, made of ancient wood and red clay, but every villager knew it was the heart of their existence. Inside, a flame that had burned for more than 3 centuries flickered day and night. The elders said that as long as the flame stayed alive, the village would remain safe, crops would grow, disease would stay at bay, and harmony would rule their lives. When a child was born, the first smoke from the flame was blown gently over the baby's forehead. When someone passed away, their spirit was believed to join the flame before it journeyed to the realm of the ancestors. It was more than a symbol, it was the living soul of Kumbasa. Life in the village flowed with quiet dignity. Women sang as they pounded grain, their melodies blending with the distant hum of insects. Children chased each other through the dusty paths, their laughter echoing through the trees. Hunters returned at dusk with stories of the forest spirits who guided their steps. Elders gathered beneath the great baobab tree to tell tales that kept the history of the people alive. Every person, young and old, understood their place in the chain of existence. They knew that to break that chain was to invite ruin. At the head of this peaceful community stood Chief Okande, a man in his late 50s with broad shoulders, sharp eyes, and a voice that carried authority without force. He had inherited leadership from his father, who had inherited it from his own father before him. Okande was admired for his calm judgment and his ability to settle disputes with fairness. Villagers often said he carried the weight of the ancestors in his chest, that he could hear the voices of the old ones whispering guidance when the village faced difficult decisions. And for many years, Okande lived up to that belief. But behind the wisdom and respect that surrounded him, there was another side of Okande, a side that few had ever seen. As younger men began to travel to distant towns and return with tales of new markets, shining objects, and grand opportunities, a quiet restlessness grew in the chief's heart. He wondered why Kumbasa remained the same while the world outside changed so quickly. Why should he, a ruler descended from powerful chiefs, remain confined to traditions set long before his birth? Why should he settle for simple living when his status could bring him something greater? These thoughts did not come all at once. They slipped into his mind like shadows at sunset, slow, quiet, unnoticed until they became impossible to ignore. Okande knew very well that ambition could be dangerous. The elders always warned. A leader's greatest enemy is the hunger within. Yet he told himself he only wanted what was best for the village. He convinced himself that Kumbasa needed progress, that the ancestors would understand. Still, somewhere deep inside, he felt the thin line he was stepping across. And each time he passed the shrine and saw the ancestral flame dance softly in the dim light, he wondered if the spirits were watching him more closely than before. This is where the story begins, not with chaos, but with calm. Not with betrayal, but with a heart quietly drifting toward it. For in Kumbasa, every blessing came from the ancestors, and every misfortune was a warning from them. And as the winds shifted over the savanna, carrying the scent of distant travelers and unknown opportunities, a silent tension began to settle over the village. Something was approaching, something that would test the strength of tradition, the power of faith, and the soul of their chief. The winds of change arrived in Kumbasa on an unusually hot afternoon, when a line of horses approached the village, carrying goods wrapped in bright fabrics and boxes of polished wood. At their center rode a stranger whose appearance immediately set him apart. His clothes were finer than anything the villagers had seen, his boots shined like obsidian, and his smile carried the confidence of a man who believed he could bend any place to his will. His name was Maleko, a merchant from far-off lands, and he claimed to have traveled across deserts and mountains in search of new alliances. The people of Kumbasa gathered curiously as Maleko presented gifts, salt blocks, metal tools, beads that sparkled like trapped stars. Such luxuries were rare in the village, and even the elders could not hide their amazement. Maleko spoke with charm, praising the beauty of Kumbasa, its fertile lands, and its rich traditions. He bowed respectfully before Chief Okande and expressed admiration for the ancestral wisdom that guided the village. But behind every word, Okande sensed a layered intention, a purpose hidden beneath the merchant's polite gestures. That evening, Maleko requested a private meeting with the chief. As the sun sank into the horizon, casting long shadows across the chief's hut, Maleko unrolled a map marked with symbols and lines. He pointed to the land surrounding the shrine of the ancestral flame, explaining that beneath the sacred soil lay rare minerals capable of bringing immense wealth. He spoke of roads, trade networks, and opportunities that could transform Kumbasa from a humble village into a thriving center of commerce. All he asked, he said with a silky voice, was permission to access and develop the land. At first, Okande stiffened with rejection. The land Maleko pointed to was the heart of Kumbasa's spiritual identity, not land that could be owned or traded, but land belonging to the ancestors. This place is not mine to offer, Okande said firmly. It has been protected since the time of our founders. Maleko nodded as if he understood, but his eyes gleamed like a hunter who had spotted a weakness in his prey. In the days that followed, Maleko did not push openly. Instead, he remained in the village, mingling with families, telling stories of prosperous towns and bustling markets. He quietly delivered gifts to Okande, fine cloth, rare spices, a blade carved with intricate designs. He spoke of leadership that embraced progress, of chiefs who shaped the future rather than clung to the past. And though Okande insisted he was unmoved, something inside him had shifted the moment Maleko arrived. Each night, as the village slept, Okande remained awake, sitting by the soft glow of a lamp. He imagined what the village could become, fields irrigated by new systems, children attending schools in the modern world, markets overflowing with travelers and goods. He pictured himself not merely as a village chief, but as a respected figure in distant lands. He justified these thoughts by telling himself that the ancestors wanted their descendants to thrive. But deep down, he knew the voice whispering to him was not the voice of the ancestors, it was the voice of ambition. One evening, as Okande passed by the shrine of the ancestral flame, the flame wavered violently. Despite the still air, it flickered as if struggling against an unseen force, casting strange, twisting shadows on the clay walls. The sight unsettled him. For the first time in decades, the flame looked weak. He knelt briefly, touching the ground with his fingertips, but instead of feeling comforted, he felt watched, judged, even. He quickly stood and walked away, dismissing the moment as coincidence, yet the image of the trembling flame lingered in his mind. Meanwhile, Maleko grew bolder. He met with Okande again, this time offering not only wealth but influence, connections to rulers in nearby regions, access to protections and alliances. Your village deserves more than simple traditions can give, Maleko whispered. And you, Chief Okande, deserve to lead a future far greater than this small circle of huts. The words struck the chief deeper than he wished to admit. For years he had felt the world changing around him, while Kumbasa remained trapped in its ancient rhythms. He had done everything to serve the ancestors, yet progress stayed out of reach. Now, Maleko's proposal echoed in his thoughts like a forbidden melody, dangerous yet mesmerizing. And so, a conflict began to brew not in the village, but within the chief himself. As he sat beneath the great baobab tree, listening to children laugh and elders chat softly, Okande wondered whether their simple happiness was enough. Whether holding on to tradition was strength or weakness. Whether the ancestors would truly condemn him for wanting more. He did not know it yet, but with each doubt, each temptation he allowed to take root, the path toward betrayal had already begun to form beneath his feet. And just like the flickering flame that tried to warn him, something in the unseen world began to stir. The balance that had protected Kumbasa for centuries hung by a fragile thread, waiting for the moment when a single decision would change everything. The day Chief Okande crossed the line between duty and desire began like any other, roosters crowing at dawn, women drawing water from the well, children chasing each other through dusty paths. But beneath that ordinary calm, something darker pulsed in the heart of Kumbasa, something only the ancestors could sense. For weeks, Maleko's words had burrowed into Okande's thoughts like stubborn thorns. The merchant no longer needed to speak, the chief was already speaking to himself, convincing himself that the impossible could somehow be justified. Late one night, when the village lay under a blanket of quiet stars, Okande slipped out of his hut and walked toward Maleko's temporary camp. The moon shone brightly, illuminating the path as if guiding his steps toward a decision he could no longer resist. Maleko was already awake, sitting by a dim lantern as though he had been expecting him. Without a word, the merchant unrolled the same map he had shown before, his fingers tapping the sacred land surrounding the shrine. This time, Okande did not protest. His voice, once firm with ancestral authority, trembled with the weight of his desire. "If I agree," he murmured, "the village must benefit. Schools, roads, tools, markets, you will bring all these." Maleko nodded with a smile that never reached his eyes. Then he produced a document marked with foreign symbols, a crimson wax seal, pressed onto the bottom like a drop of hardened blood. Okande barely skimmed the words, he only saw the future he had imagined, rising before him like a shining mirage. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pressed his thumb onto the ink pad and left the mark of his authority on the page. In that moment, the wind stopped completely, as if the world had paused to witness the act. The crickets fell silent. Even the leaves of the baobab tree ceased their gentle rustling. Okande felt a chill run through him, but he ignored it. He tucked the gold and gifts Maleko offered into a bag and hurried back toward his hut, heart pounding like a drum in a ritual gone wrong. At dawn, Maleko's workers marched toward the forest near the shrine, carrying tools made of shining iron. Their steps shook the earth, and every villager who heard the metallic clatter felt uneasy, though none knew why. They watched from afar as the strangers chopped down ancient trees, their axes biting into wood untouched for hundreds of years. The sound echoed through the village like a wound tearing open. Birds fled, startled and confused, circling the sky in frantic patterns. Inside the shrine of the ancestral flame, the flame that had burned unwaveringly for centuries began to shudder. Its once steady glow wavered violently, shrinking and then flaring as though gasping for breath. An elder tending the shrine cried out in fear as the flame twisted into a thin, fragile thread, then vanished, leaving behind only a thin curl of smoke rising into the air. The elders rushed inside, shouting prayers, shaking rattles, pleading for the ancestors not to abandon them. But the shrine remained silent. For the first time since the founding of Kumbasa, darkness sat where the flame should have been. Whispers spread through the village in the hours that followed. Chickens stopped laying eggs. A baby woke screaming and could not be soothed. The wind carried a strange, metallic scent, and even the dogs refused to go near the forest. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Elders gathered beneath the baobab tree with troubled faces. Something in the spiritual fabric of the village had been torn, and though no one understood how, they felt it deeply. That afternoon, the elders confronted Chief Okande, their voices trembling with fear and suspicion. "The ancestors are restless," they said. "The shrine has lost its flame. Something unnatural has happened." Okande felt his throat tighten. The truth pressed heavily on him, but he forced his face into a mask of calm authority. "It is simply a sign of changing seasons," he lied. "The flame can be rekindled. Do not frighten the villagers." When the elders insisted that no natural force could extinguish the sacred flame, Okande silenced them sharply, accusing them of clinging to fear and superstition. The elders exchanged troubled glances, for this was not the chief they knew. But Okande turned away, refusing to hear more. He spent the rest of the day inspecting the gold hidden in his hut, pretending not to hear the distant chopping of trees or the anxious prayers drifting from the shrine. As night fell, Okande lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his hut. The silence was thick and oppressive. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind felt like a voice calling his name. He tried to convince himself he had done the right thing, that progress required sacrifice, that the ancestors should understand. But the deeper he reached for justification, the further it slipped from his grasp. He could not shake the image of the flame extinguishing, nor the sudden quiet of the animals. Even so, he told himself that the village would thank him when prosperity arrived. He clung desperately to that belief, for it was the only shield he had left against the guilt gnawing at his spirit. But outside his hut, unseen by mortal eyes, the spirits of the ancestors stirred in the shadows, their whispers rising with the night wind. Kumbasa had been betrayed, its sacred land sold, its spiritual lifeline broken. And the ancestors, who had watched over the village for generations, were no longer silent. They had begun to awaken. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the people of Kumbasa had ever experienced. The sky, once generous with its seasonal rains, hardened into an unbroken sheet of pale, merciless blue. Clouds drifted near the horizon but never crossed above the village, as if an invisible force pushed them away. The river that wound through Kumbasa shrank day by day, its once merry chatter reduced to a thin, trembling trickle. Women walked farther to fill their clay pots, and the children grew silent, watching fish float lifelessly near the surface. The crops, which had always thrived under the blessing of the ancestors, began to wither without explanation. Leaves curled like dying fingers, stalks drooped long before harvest, and even the soil felt strangely cold when farmers knelt to touch it. The villagers whispered nervously, saying the earth itself seemed angry. Some claimed the fields no longer smelled like living soil but like ash and metal. Meanwhile, the workers Maleko had brought, a group of strong, confident men, began to suffer from strange afflictions. One developed a fever so fierce he shook uncontrollably, muttering incoherent phrases about faces in the shadows. Another ran screaming from the excavation site, insisting he had seen a figure standing between the trees, a figure with hollow eyes and skin like smoke drifting above the ground. By the time night fell, several workers had abandoned the project entirely, refusing to step foot into the forest again. Maleko dismissed their fears as superstition, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his concern. Rumors spread faster than the drought. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the shrine. Elders gathered every evening, struck with fear as they watched sacred masks crack along their edges, splitting in patterns that resembled tears. The drums used for ceremonies began to hum softly at night, as if some unseen hand tapped them from the other side of the veil. No matter how tightly the villagers sealed the shrine, they found the doors slightly open every morning, as though the spirits themselves wandered restlessly through the village. It was during one of those nights, when the air felt heavy with impending doom, that Chief Okande had the dream. He found himself standing in the forest, the trees towering above him like silent judges. A fog rolled in from all sides, swallowing the ground until only the tops of the trees remained visible. From that fog emerged a figure, tall, majestic, wrapped in shimmering robes of dust and starlight. The figure's face was familiar in a way Okande could not explain, as though he had seen it in carvings, stories, and visions his entire life. Okande, the figure's voice boomed, echoing through the forest, "You have sold what was not yours to sell." The chief tried to speak, but his tongue felt heavy, glued to the roof of his mouth. The ancestral spirit stepped closer, its eyes glowing like embers pulled from the heart of the vanished flame. "The land does not belong to you. It belongs to the spirits who bled for it, built upon it, and protected it long before your name was even spoken." Okande felt his knees buckle. He dropped to the ground, trembling as the spirit's gaze pierced through him. "Your betrayal has broken the covenant," the spirit continued. "And the village suffers because of you." When Okande finally managed to whisper a plea for forgiveness, the spirit raised a hand, not in anger, but in profound disappointment. "What is broken may yet be mended," it said. "But every choice has its price." The forest shattered like glass, and Okande awoke drenched in sweat, gasping for air. He looked around his hut, but the shadows clung to the corners like living things, twisting, whispering. He stumbled outside, desperate for light, but even the moon seemed colder than before, its glow pale and unfriendly. The dream clung to him like a weight on his chest, and though he knew he should confess everything, fear tightened around him like a rope. He could not bear to face the elders, the villagers, or the truth. As the days passed, the omens worsened. The storm that had been circling the region finally came, but only above the land near the shrine. Thunder rolled like an angry drum, and lightning cracked in jagged lines, striking the ground again and again as if the ancestors were trying to tear open the earth. Yet, strangely, not a single drop of rain fell on the village. It was as though the heavens punished the land but withheld mercy from the people. Children cried at night, waking from nightmares of enormous shadows crawling along the walls. Hunters returned from the forest empty-handed, claiming the animals had vanished. The village healer sensed a shift in the spiritual balance, thinning of the veil that protected Kumbasa. "The ancestors no longer walk with us," he murmured one evening, staring into the dim glow of a dying fire. "They stand at the edge, watching, waiting." In those uneasy, silence-filled nights, even Okande began to feel the presence of the ancestors moving through the village like a cold wind. When he sat alone, he heard footsteps behind him, soft, slow, deliberate, but when he turned, no one was there. The gold he had accepted felt heavier each time he touched it, as if it carried the weight of every broken promise. And though he still clung to that hope that things would improve, the truth whispered to him relentlessly. His betrayal had stirred forces he could not control, forces that were now turning their gaze toward him. The wrath of the ancestors had begun, and Kumbasa trembled beneath its shadow. As the suffering deepened, the village teetered on the edge of collapse. Every face in Kumbasa carried the same haunted look. a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The elders gathered daily beneath the baobab tree, praying, chanting, and calling out to the ancestors with voices trembling from desperation. But no answer came. The silence of the spirits felt heavier than any thunderstorm, more terrifying than any enemy. It was the silence of abandonment. Okande felt this weight more than anyone. The dream continued to stalk his mind, replaying each time he closed his eyes. He saw the accusing glow in the spirit's gaze, heard the words that struck deep into his soul, "You have sold what was not yours to sell." Guilt gnawed at him like a starving animal. The villagers' suffering pressed on him from every direction, children crying from hunger, fathers returning from the fields with empty hands, mothers whispering prayers that dissolved into sobs. Everywhere Okande walked, he felt invisible fingers pulling at his conscience. Yet he still hesitated to speak. Pride held his tongue. Fear stiffened his spine. He told himself that reversing his decision would make him look weak, foolish, unworthy of leadership. And deep inside, a small voice whispered that the wealth hidden in his hut could still bring him the future he dreamed of. But the louder voice, the voice of the ancestors, echoed relentlessly, drowning his excuses in their growing fury. One night, as lightning continued to strike the sacred land without rain, Okande found himself unable to sleep. The air was thick and oppressive, as if the entire world held its breath. He stepped outside, and the village lay silent. No dogs barked. No fires burned. Even the insects had grown quiet. In that unnatural stillness, Okande felt something watching him, something vast and ancient, hovering just behind the veil of the night. He walked without knowing where his feet were taking him, until he found himself standing before the ruined shrine of the ancestral flame. The structure was cracked, splintered, and dark, like the remains of a heart torn apart. Okande felt a wave of shame wash over him. He approached the center of the shrine and saw the stone basin that once held the eternal flame, now filled with ashes cold as death. A gust of wind swept through the shrine, scattering ashes across the floor. The moment they touched his skin, Okande fell to his knees. He could no longer pretend. He could no longer run. His voice broke from his throat in a trembling whisper. "Ancestors, forgive me." The words echoed into the night, fragile and sorrowful. And as they faded, he felt something loosen inside him, pride crumbling, fear melting, leaving only the raw truth of his guilt. The next morning, Okande gathered the entire village beneath the baobab tree. The people came slowly, suspicious, tired, wary. The elders stood with arms crossed, their faces set in stone. Every eye turned toward the chief as he climbed onto the ceremonial platform. For a long, unbearable moment, he said nothing. The village waited in suffocating silence. Then Okande's voice finally rose, but not with the strength they once knew. It was the voice of a man carrying the weight of his own downfall. He confessed everything, how he had signed away the sacred land, how he had accepted Maleko's gifts, how he had ignored every warning sign. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some cried out in anger, others in disbelief. Mothers clutched their children. Elders shook their heads as if witnessing the crumbling of their entire world. Okande bowed his head and stated plainly that he was ready to accept whatever punishment the village and the ancestors decided. He spoke with a trembling humility he had never shown before. "I have broken the covenant," he said. "But if there is still a path to saving this village, I will walk it, even if it costs me everything I have." For a moment, no one moved. Then Elder Nyamu, the oldest man in Kumbasa and the keeper of the ancestral songs, stepped forward. His voice was deep and steady as he announced that the only hope left was a cleansing ritual, one that required truth, sacrifice, and the symbolic restoration of what had been broken. But the ritual demanded a price. Okande must give up all the wealth he had accepted, everything he had gained from betrayal. And after the ritual, he must step down as chief. Okande nodded without hesitation, for the weight of his guilt had already stripped him of the desire for power. The ritual began at dusk. The villagers gathered in a circle around the shrine, their faces illuminated by torches. The elders chanted ancient words, calling upon the ancestors to witness the reckoning. Okande knelt at the center, trembling but resolute. One by one, he placed Maleko's gold and treasures into a fire pit, watching the flames consume every piece of ill-gotten wealth until nothing remained but melted remnants and smoke. As the fire roared, a wind swept across the village, cool, soft, and strangely familiar. The torches flickered. The trees swayed. And for the first time since the tragedy began, the villagers felt something shift in the air. Something hopeful. When the final chants ended, a spark flickered in the stone basin of the shrine. A tiny flame, weak but alive, appeared at its center. Gasps rose from the crowd. Tears flowed freely. The ancestral flame was returning. But though Kumbasa was saved, Okande's fate was sealed. He stepped down from his position and retreated to a small hut at the edge of the village, where he lived quietly, tending to the soil and offering prayers each morning and night. Some villagers avoided him, others forgave him in time. But Okande never asked for anything. His heart was set on rebuilding what he had broken, even if he never regained the respect he once held. And so, the village healed slowly, guided once again by the ancestors' watchful presence. The rains returned. The crops revived. The dreams of the villagers grew peaceful once more. But the story of Okande remained, a warning whispered to every future chief: no wealth is worth the price of betraying the spirits who gave life to the land. The story of Kumbasa became more than a tale of tragedy and redemption. It grew into a guiding legend passed from older to child, from chief to successor, woven into the spiritual identity of the community. Years after Okande's fall, the villagers still gathered beneath the baobab tree to retell the events, not with anger or bitterness, but with a solemn respect for the lessons that had emerged from their suffering. For in the deep shadows of the past, they had found truths that would shape their future. The first lesson was about the sacredness of trust, the delicate thread that connected leaders to the people who depended on them. Okande's betrayal was not born out of hatred or malice, but out of ambition, vanity, and the desire to be remembered as a great chief. Yet these human weaknesses, when left unchecked, proved strong enough to sever the bond between the living and the dead. The villagers came to understand that leadership was not about power or comfort, but about responsibility, humility, and the courage to place the community above oneself. They taught their children that even the strongest leader could fall if he allowed his heart to wander from the path of integrity. The second lesson lay in the role of the ancestors, not as distant, fearsome beings, but as guardians who depended on the living just as much as the living depended on them. The ancestors were not simply spirits in the wind, they were the memory of the land, the continuity of identity, the soul of the village. When Okande sold the sacred ground, he did not just violate a place, he severed a connection, a lifeline that held the community steady through generations. The villagers learned that honoring the ancestors was not a ritual performed for tradition's sake, it was a living dialogue, a relationship that required respect, gratitude, and constant awareness of the past. The third lesson was about temptation. Maleko's promises glittered like gold in the sunlight, but they hid a darkness that only became visible when it was too late. The villagers realized that danger often arrived not in storms or beasts or invading warriors, but in the quiet voice of opportunity that whispered to their desires. They learned that the most harmful choices were not always forced, they were often chosen willingly, by those who believed they could escape the consequences. And so the elders taught the youth that true wisdom lay not in chasing every advantage, but in discerning which blessings carried a hidden price. The fourth and perhaps deepest lesson was forgiveness, not kindness for its own sake, but a healing that flowed from understanding the frailty of the human spirit. When Okande confessed, many villagers felt torn between anger and compassion. But time softened their pain. They saw in his lonely hut a man striving each day to repair the thread he had broken. His downfall became a reminder that redemption was not a moment but a journey, one that required patience, truth, and a willingness to face one's own shadows. Over the years, the village learned that justice could coexist with mercy, and that even those who stumbled could become examples of humility and strength. And finally, the greatest lesson was unity, the realization that a village without harmony could crumble faster than any shrine. During the crisis, fear had nearly turned them against one another, suspicions grew, tempers flared, and hope dimmed. But when Okande revealed the truth, the villagers stood together, not as scattered individuals, but as a single voice calling out to the ancestors. Their unity restored the flame. Their shared grief mended the wound. Their collective spirit brought back the balance they thought lost forever. From that day forward, every celebration, every ritual, every gathering began with a prayer for unity, for they understood that the ancestors answered not the loudest voice, but the most harmonious one. In the quiet years that followed, Kumbasa flourished once more. Seasons came and went, children grew into adults, and new chiefs rose to leadership, each one reminded of the covenant they were sworn to uphold. Every leader walked past the restored shrine of the ancestral flame with a sense of reverence, knowing that beneath its glowing fire lay the memory of a mistake so costly it could never be forgotten. And at the edge of the village, Okande grew old in silence, tending to the shrine's grounds, whispering prayers for those who would come after him. Though he never regained his title, his humility and devotion became a second legacy, a living example that even broken paths could lead back to truth. Generations later, parents told their children, remember the chief who sold the ancestors. Remember the suffering that followed. But also remember how the village rose again. For stories in the traditions of Africa were not merely entertainment, they were bridges to the past, warnings for the present, and guides for the future. And as the night winds carried the echoes of drums and the chants of elders, one truth endured above all. No blessing built upon betrayal can stand, but a community that honors its ancestors walks forever in the light.